Hello my dear friends, how are you? Welcome. Thank you for joining me here once again. I'm Mari Thiriger and today I'll be delivering the last subject of this year, which is about some Nordic pagan traditions that have been recently made and, wrongly lead people to a misleading perspective on the true pagan traditions of the past. I'm not talking about New Age spirituality because that's a whole other point which is hard enough to dig through, and I've shown a lot of examples in past videos. I'm talking about other recent invented traditions that people usually assume to be of pagan origins, but made up in periods of history not only far from the pagan past, but also already a little bit far from our contemporary time, which makes it even harder to dig through. What will be discussed here today is with the aim to show you that there's this cultural reality in every country's history, which is the creation of recent traditions that are either made up to pass on a fake pagan or ancestral past, or they are simply the continuation of creating culture, but people soon forget about its creation and purpose, and in a couple of centuries, even though people carry on the new traditions due to forgetting when and how and why they were invented, assume to be older than what it really is. But when I say invented traditions, we have to take into consideration two important points. As Dr. Luke Randall and Dr. Hull Whitehead defined, culture is information or behavior shared by a population or subpopulation which is acquired from conspecifics through some form of social learning, right? So, culture is very much something that is always changing and evolving, and the more humans interact with one another, more and different culture will be produced. When any human follows a trend or a certain behavior or mannerism that is appealing in some form, the human being is extending that cultural aspect, adapting it, transforming it, changing it, and therefore creating culture. Now, picking on that point, we will always have invented traditions because everything in culture is invented or reinvented, adopted and reshaped, remade or transformed. So just because there's the recent invention of cultural aspects and traditions doesn't make them lesser in value somehow, or doesn't make them untrue or fake. We will always create new traditions until they get old with the passage of time. Likewise, just because a tradition is old doesn't make it better or worse, and certainly doesn't make it more valid than a new tradition, because everything is made up to fit human needs and desires. But this video today is to show you that we human beings have a short memory and we create new things which we soon forget the purpose and meaning, and we may carry on with these new things we invent because it has become tradition, but due to forgetfulness on when and why they were invented, we always put on them this vague idea of being old and probably ancestral or pagan or prehistoric and such. This is why humanity needs history and other social and human sciences to help people remember and to discern the truth, right? Otherwise, anyone can alter the truth and reality for their own goals and easily manipulate people into believing whatever they want. Also, I would like to point out that part of this video, an important part of this video, is a work put out by professors Johnny Langer and Luciana de Campos from the Federal University of Paraíba, Brazil, which have been making a wonderful work and contribution to Nordic and Scandinavian medieval studies, and I want to thank them for their work. And I thought this subject they wrote about would be important to address here today to reach more people, right? To create awareness. Now, following this study on new and modern creations or inventions of Nordic pagan traditions, I would like to address that tartan pattern right there in the background, you see, because modern traditions that often pass as ancestral or pagan can be found everywhere, absolutely everywhere. And some of you have been asking me from which clan or family with that particular pattern do I belong to, Scottish clan or family. As some of you have been interested in my Celtic past, which is indeed a past that has greatly marked and shaped what would become in the Middle Ages the Kingdom of Portugal, to which I belong to, or I was born at. And indeed, despite Portuguese being a Romance language with great influences from Latin, obviously, both Portuguese and French are the two Romance languages with more, much more Celtic influences than any other. And that's a curiosity I may talk about in the future. But well, I don't know how long that blanket has been in the family. And curiously, I do have indeed Scottish ancestry, according to my DNA analysis. Side note, would you be interested in a video about my DNA results? Let me know, and I may do a video on that in the future. But anyway, tartan patterns and kilts, a garment resembling a knee-length skirt, traditionally with a tartan pattern, is not of Celtic origins, right? Not only we see depicted quite a lot Celts wearing kilts or some sort of garment in a tartan pattern, or movies and books in Scotland, and they are all Celtic and such, but these are very common misconceptions. Several European traditions and practices that are normally considered very old, contrary to what is popularly believed, were created recently. That's the main point of this video, and I'm using that blanket as an example. The use of male skirt kilt by Scots, which is undoubtedly a very important mark of national identity, which supposedly has been created by the Celts, but which in reality appeared in the 18th century. It has nothing to do with the Celts. Now, I also take the opportunity, speaking of the Scots and the Portuguese and their Celtic past, what is the first musical instrument that we associate with the Scots? The bagpipes, right? Well, the bagpipe is also a traditional Portuguese instrument, musical instrument, especially in the north of the country and in the highlands. The bagpipes as a traditional instrument in Portugal is actually older, far older than in Scotland. Be that as it may, this immediately leads people to also think that this instrument is of Celtic origin, given the cultural and ethnic influences that both countries have. There is certainly a great controversy about the origins of bagpipes, but it is certain that the origin is not Celtic. The bagpipe was introduced in Europe through the Mediterranean by Arabic populations and by influences from the Middle East, most likely at the beginning of the Middle Ages. It is a myth that bagpipes are associated with people descended from the Celts, a myth created by the New Age movement and the ignorance that created the Celtomania phenomenon, right? That was just another example. With this being said, let's delve into today's subject, if you please. Following the perspective of the invention of traditions previously mentioned and with some examples, let's see some Nordic practices and customs interpreted as pre-Christian, but which are nevertheless modern creations. We have certainly seen many descriptions and illustrations of the goddess Frigga, with her distaff or spinning wheel many times before, right? Since the 19th century, many researchers have collected folklore accounts in Sweden relating the constellation Orion with the name Frigrocken, Frigg's distaff. Several Scandinavians consider these reports to be truly pre-Christian traditions and accounts, but we have three problems with this. To begin with, there are no reports, no accounts prior to the 18th century confirming these oral narratives. Furthermore, the spinning wheel was only known in Europe from the 13th century onwards, well after the so-called Viking Age. And finally, the only reliable document we have for pre-Christian Norse, or Nordic in general, celestial mythology is an Icelandic manuscript which, in its 12th century section, records that the constellation Orion received the native name Fiskikarlar, the fisherman, that is, without any connection with the figure of the goddess Frigg or with weaving. In several late medieval Swedish churches, the Virgin Mary and the figure of Eve appear weaving on manual spindles. And precisely Swedish popular folklore also dominates the Orion constellation as the distaff of Mary, parallel to that of Frigg. Here it seems the case of an appropriation or re-signification of an ancient deity in an antiquarian sense from the world of weaving, and at the same time strengthening a certain regional identity in the interpretation of the constellation. Not only in illustrations, books, films and art about Norse paganism, but also in Nordic European paganism in general, we see a lot of the use of garlands and the whole theme of pagan-inspired Nordic festivals. The use of garlands has not been attested in pre-Christian Norse world so far. Practically the only European area that saw the widespread use of garlands in antiquity was the Mediterranean. However, during the Renaissance, artists created dozens of paintings with the theme of Greco-Roman mythology, the figures carrying garlands in everyday situations or festivities. So this Renaissance artistic trend was also carried over into Nordic art, using Greco-Roman themes to illustrate various Nordic cultural situations and aspects. Soon this same theme was applied to other religions and cultures of the past, such as that of the Celts, Druids, as an example, often wearing garlands in romantic paintings. In modern times, they also began to be included and used in Christmas celebrations and decorations. But it is important to remember that the popularization of Christmas as we know it today, like the Christmas trees with garlands, roast turkey, a great feast of an abundant supper, the family together and such, came only after A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, 1843, who basically invented Christmas as we know it today and as we tend to practice it. As for the use of garlands in modern reinterpretations of Norse paganism, it occurred essentially in the visual arts after the 19th century, but especially in cinema and audiovisual media during the 20th century. So historically speaking, garlands are just a tradition from the pagan Mediterranean world, mostly of Greco-Roman origin. Now, personally, I see no problem in using them in several different modern pagan activities, but it is important to know the origin of things and how they came to be introduced and when, to avoid the manipulation of reality, which often gives rise to gatekeeping culture and use culture for appropriation of ideas to pass on several political ideologies in an attempt to control the masses. Ignorance is a weapon used against the ignorant. Finally, another Nordic tradition deemed to be of pagan origins is the Julenek. The Julenek Christmas sheaf is the practice of tying bundles of grain to a pole across the countryside during Christmas time in Norway. It was mentioned in documents for the first time in the 18th century, but it was already considered superstitious and prohibited by religious authorities a century earlier. Nowadays, the practice is extremely popular both in the countryside and in cities. There were specific rules for hanging the mast with this sheaf, but they varied in Norway, all across Norway. In some places it was placed early in the morning, in other places in the afternoon, and in others only on Christmas Eve. It was always observed whether the birds ate the cereals or not. If so, it was a sign that the next harvest would be plentiful. If not, the harvest would be a disaster. The types of birds and their behaviors also determine the predictions. And in Sweden, the mast was known as Julenek and was made from grain from the last harvest, and the prediction system was similar to that of the Norwegian one. The practice of Julenek must have occurred in the Middle Ages, most likely, and even have much older roots, probably. Now, the biggest problem is with its interpretation. Researchers since the 19th century have linked it to a cult of the god Odin, an idea that is still very popular on the internet today. The question is, or should be, is there any direct evidence of this relationship? There are folk traditions with authentic pre-Christian content, mind you, and obviously, such as the Yule book, here spoken before on another video, and the various motifs of the wild hunt across Northern Europe as well, also associated with the Christmas period, right? But nowadays, both researchers and people in general have a very, it's true, a very simplistic view of ancient Norse religions and belief systems, due to the great amount of assumptions and misconceptions and lies and inventions over the years, precisely due to the lack of information on such subjects and scientific research on the subjects. The main error concerning Old Norse and or Nordic pre-Christian beliefs is that of being a homogeneous framework. It isn't, never was. The idea that everyone performed the same rituals and everyone worshipped the same gods in the Viking Age, which is a big mistake. Also here spoken before on another video. One example is the solstice festival of Yule, as it was associated with fertility issues, and Odin has connections with Yule through one of its many names, Mjolnir. And so things end up being connected in modern interpretations because of the disregard for the sources and contexts, and the usual tendency of transporting modern views and beliefs into the past. But as has been said in past videos, things are a little bit more complex than that. In reality, Yule, the celebration, was a great public festival with several facets, also depending on the source, of course. One of its main aspects, without a doubt, is fertility, but in this case, the animal sacrificed was the pig or the boar, and the gods involved essentially were Freyr and Freyja, who were directly connected to crops and the harvest. But Yule also had an aspect related to ancestors and the dead. And here comes the god Odin, indeed. Being an aristocratic deity, he essentially fulfilled a cosmic role, where new times were celebrated as opposed to chaos. And the various myths related to the wild hunt have their origins in this worldview. The banquets here had the function of uniting the dead with the living. In this sense, we can say that Julenek was not an invented pagan tradition in itself, but its association with Odin was very much. This connection was both the product of a greater lack of knowledge about pre-Christian beliefs and a contemporary tendency to relate all forms of paganism to the one-eyed god. Not everything is related to the god Odin. Not everything has to do with Odin, right? Well, my dear friends, I do hope you have enjoyed this video. I hope it was useful, given the time of the year and its celebrations. Speaking of this time of the year, for those of you seeking to acquire magical power, remember and don't forget that we are close to New Year's Eve, and it is the perfect time to carry on with another tradition, circumambulation. As it is known in Sweden, Hårsgång, the year walk, right? So, my dear friends, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video. Happy celebrations and a Happy New Year. I'll see you on the next video. As always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Until we meet again, my dear friends.